I'm Marshall Kosloff, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
I'm joined today by Hudson Institute's Bryan Clark and Dan Patt of the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. In this conversation, we cover emerging technologies, how a future of commoditized and individual products can address military and strategic questions facing the United States, and how these issues are playing out on the ground in Ukraine and could play out in a future conflict in the Indo-Pacific region.
Our traditional approach to dealing with the Taiwan invasion might be to use bombers and tactical aircraft with a bunch of long-range anti-ship missiles to blow up amphibious ships before they hit Taiwan. If you're China, you'll just develop a way to deal with that particular threat and say, well, that's the main avenue they're going to have to counter us. We can prepare for that. But now if the U.S. also fields unmanned surface vehicles that are based in Taiwan, or unmanned undersea vehicles, they're going to drive out there and just get in the way of this massive armada coming across the Taiwan Strait and start blowing up ships, as if it were, Crimea in Ukraine, as we're seeing in the last couple of weeks. Well, then now have to defend against those. And you have to, the defense against those undersea and surface threats are going to actually take away from your ability to effectively defend against the air threat. And so now these multiple threats from multiple axes are creating a structured attack that now presents a set of dilemmas that may make it so that it's so uncertain of your being successful that you decide to wait and maybe not pursue the invasion after all.
Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Bryan Clark and Dan Patt, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks, Marshall. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall.
Yeah, great to chat with you two. I think because you two have interesting backgrounds and this is a very specific space, I'd love for you two just to introduce yourselves, especially in the context of the center's work. Let's start with you, Bryan.
So I've been at Hudson Institute, where I'm a senior fellow, for about 3 years. We started this center, the Defense Concepts and Technology Center, at that point. And what we focus on is the kind of convergence between defense operations, military operations, and strategy, and emerging technologies. So how emerging technologies are going to change how militaries operate and how we organize and train and equip them. The reason I kind of came into this area is my background is as a submariner. I spent my entire career in the Navy, 25 years as a submariner, where technology was really kind of the heart and soul of the force. And then in my last tour, I was the director of the CNO's Commanders Action Group, which is his internal think tank, which is, led me to think maybe I want to do that kind of research and, kind of free thinking sort of exploration on my own as a civilian. So that's why I went into think tanks after I retired from the Navy. But it's been great being at Hudson, where we've been able to really explore areas that we find interesting, where we think emerging technologies are going to dramatically change how militaries operate and the opportunities both in strategy and in terms of how militaries interact with each other and how military victory and success is achieved.
I like to think of myself as a misfit in the think tank world. My background's technical. I'm an engineer, a PhD in aerospace engineering. My first professional love was of aircraft and aircraft design, and tracked trying to build unmanned systems through my early career. Eventually brought me to DARPA, and at DARPA, my aperture started opening up. I started to understand that as much as I loved aircraft and even the new thing, unmanned aircraft, drones, there was a broader context. It mattered a lot how you used capability, that's operational concepts, right? Either concept of employment, how you say take an aircraft or a drone and how you use it to an objective, or an operational concept, or just like how you take a group of them and the people who operate them and how you do creative things. And so as my horizon started broadening there at DARPA, I think I started to care more about the policy implications for technology and the intersection of technology and policy. So Bryan's work was a natural fit there. He had a lot of really interesting things, and we started striking up a conversation. At DARPA, I launched this Mosaic Warfare initiative with some other colleagues at DARPA, and Bryan was really helped understand, shape, communicate that. I also got some chance inside the department to work on these sort of broader concepts. So for me, it's, this gradual progression from being an engineer to now working with Bryan on trying to study and proselytize on the implications of technology for the future of national security.
I'd love to start really simple and we can just zoom out. What are some technologies that have emerged over the past decade or so that are already seeing shift the strategic, tactical, overall military defense outlook for the country? If this were the 1990s, we could talk about drones, but is there anything that comes to mind contemporarily?
You mentioned drones. I think we've really seen in the last couple of years is uncrewed systems take a kind of center stage in the future of military operations in a way that they really had not previously. So we've had drones for a long time, but they've been very constrained in terms of how they've been used. They've really been extensions of manned platforms like ships and airplanes. They've really just been used in this very limited set of circumstances like surveillance, targeting, maybe striking targets in a very individualized way. And what you're seeing now is the shift towards uncrewed systems really being in all domains, and then being used for any kind of operation. So you're being used in any place you would use a traditional platform is being shifted over to an uncrewed system. So I think that's one of the biggest shifts is not just the fact that drones exist, but the fact that they have now been operationalized, proliferated, made available commercially in a way that allows them to be employed at scale and by militaries across the board, not just the highest end ones. Another area we've been looking at is the changing nature of decision making in warfare and how tools like computer aided decision aids. I don't want to say artificial intelligence, but really just the idea of computer aided decision making is enabling us to make better decisions, try to make our adversaries make worse decisions. It also allows us to integrate forces in new ways. So combining military units in ways they didn't used to combine is really a function of computer-aided decision aids, software-defined networking and radios. Those technologies for command and control communications have really advanced in a way that allows you to really mix and match militaries in a way that they had not previously. And I guess the last thing is in terms of shaping perceptions. That's probably the area of technology I think is getting a lot less attention and probably shouldn't be is how new technologies for being able to change how your opponent views your forces as well as views what's happening around them through deception, through electronic warfare, through cyber operations, through disinformation. Those tools that allow you to shape an enemy's behavior and perceptions are going to be increasingly important in terms of deterrence and then success in military operations. And those are really three big areas that we've been looking at in the center, those three areas of technology.
I think another way of framing that is like, the big shift is still in information technologies. And this is such a big shift. And it's so vast and it's so profound that we're going to be on this ride for a decade and more. And, a simple story I like to tell is, it's useful to think about military capability from World War II to now in sort of three eras. The first is that of these superior platforms. And this is the age of the Rocket Men, and this is the age of the Kelly Johnson Skunk Works, and building these amazing aircraft and similarly amazing ships and tanks and ground vehicles. This is the thing that made me an aerospace engineer, thinking about this golden age of one aircraft to the next and their enhanced performance characteristics. And then what we started to see was information technologies would creep into that. And how did that show up? Well, most visibly or most notably, say with the stealth fighter, F-117A, where we added a computer. Now we had precision targeting and we had automated flight control, and we coupled that with precision weapons, right? So it wasn't just platforms. It was now these platforms which were powered by information technologies. We added the computers to them. But, what we see now is we see this, increasing shift where what matters most is my information processing, is my network. What is my global sensing network. Sometimes it's from commercial satellites, and sometimes it's from military sensors. And it is at this highest level, is this sort of large scale information network level. We actually drive the activities of the platforms. So, stealth aircraft are still important. U.S. still has an advantage in there, but those are now sort of subservient to or slave to this larger information system. And I think this framing, it takes what Bryan said about, say, for example, shaping, and it explains why this is such an opportunity, right? From the notion that I start thinking about, I have this challenge of gathering information and sense making that is at this global level. And this is the primary technology opportunity for the Department of Defense, for the national security community is there. There's all of these other things I can do that don't necessarily require building or buying a platform. Some of them do. There's still opportunities for new and better craft, new and better sensing, but information technologies, it's such a big sweeping change.
Yeah, and I think something that gets short shrift is when people say information technology, when Dan says that, I think people think of that as just being ones and zeros and the network and what you see on a screen somewhere. But it also means being able to take a bunch of units that didn't used to talk to each other or work with each other and combine them into a force that's able to do an operation in a way that's coherent. So we used to have to do that by just training everybody because it was all people that were doing the integration. Now it's all machine to machine communication that does the integration. So the information technology allows me to take 12 drones, combine them with a fighter aircraft, and combine them with a commercial satellite for information, and be able to turn that into a kill chain, to use that term, which didn't used to be possible. And so now if you're an enemy facing that, you really don't know exactly what configuration your adversary is likely to come in, because they can use information technologies to manifest in these very physical ways that again then gives you a decision-making advantage, because if you can slow down your your opponent's decision-making or diagnosis of your force, then you get an advantage. So I think, it's also it's not just a matter of things happening on a screen. It's also, how does that facilitate things happening in the real world?
Something I'm really curious about, especially going to the theme of the show, obviously we're titled Arsenal of Democracy, so there's going to be a lot of focus on defense industrial base issues. And what I just can't stop thinking about whenever I speak to folks like you is we're talking about zeros and ones, IT, the kill chain, yet at the same time we struggle to produce artillery shells at a rate that would meet, let's say, our strategic needs in a conflict like the one in Ukraine. So how do the two of you just consider the futuristic emerging parts with how conventional so many of our needs seem to be at the moment right now?
Well, the needs of Ukraine are conventional because they're fighting a conventional war that's not going to be how the U.S. fights in the future. The U.S. fight with China, for example, if there is one, is not going to look like the war in Ukraine. It's not going to be an artillery-heavy slog, through small incremental changes on the battlefield. It's going to be a long-range precision strike, lots of electromagnetic warfare, lots of cyber attacks. It's going to be much more a maneuver warfare than it is going to be an attrition warfare fight. And the reason Ukraine is forced to do that is because it really hasn't been equipped in a way that will allow it to have that maneuver fight that might have made it more effective against the Russians. It's how you frame this problem, right? So when you say arsenal, well, what does that arsenal consist of? I think I would argue that the arsenal of democracy going forward needs to be much more about commoditized hardware capabilities that are relatively simple to make in multiple countries and could be modularized and composed much more easily than our current kind of exquisite weapons. And those less sophisticated capabilities could be combined in new sophisticated ways using information technology. So you're able to manifest a bunch of interesting kill chains that make it hard for an enemy to counter, as opposed to relying on the individual weapons being as sophisticated as the current generation of long-range anti-ship missiles. So I think a lot of ways this arsenal of democracy discussion focuses on the wrong thing because they're thinking of fighting the last war.
And I think we need to be careful about creating this sort of false dichotomy of it's either hard power or physical forces in the real world, or it's some fancy AI future thing. That's not the way it works, right? And just as an example from somewhere else, I mean, if you go back into 1970, and you look at the companies with the largest market capitalization, which are traded on the stock exchange, they're big industrial companies, right? They are chemical manufacturers and steel manufacturers and auto manufacturers, appliance manufacturers. And you look today and yeah, they are what we would call information technology companies. They make devices and sell services. But it's not like the industrial economy went away, right? Like it's still there. Much of it's still in the US, some of it also globally. But it's not. You just add new layers on top of it. So there will always be a role for what we would call hard power and kinetic conflict in national security. That will never go away. There's always a means of settling a score. But relatively speaking, you will find greater returns on investment from turning to information technology. That's where the new opportunity space is in information technology, which now means you should probably spend time thinking about how to commoditize, reduce the cost of, increase the development of, parallelize the production of, make less specialized at least some of the physical manifestations of what we do.
You frame that, I think, effectively in terms of it's not helpful to turn this into a either or kinetic bits, 0 bits and bytes. However, you said the word investment. And when it comes to investment decision from a policymaker's perspective, that is to a certain degree a zero-sum game. Dollars are going one place to another place. Am I incorrect in kind of insinuating that? How much do you think there is like a trade-off when it comes to like investments in the future versus present concerns?
Look, there's absolutely a trade in the budget, right? It is ultimately it's up to Congress to decide whether we're going to, are we going to buy another destroyer? Are we going to buy another fighter? Or are we going to, invest in technologies and come up with electronic warfare schemes and command and control schemes and an ability to assemble forces in new ways and create new kill chains, right? There is an either or trade because that's right. At some level, the defense budget's a fixed pie, and you have to make those trades. So I can't draw my number of destroyers and fighters to zero, but I have a net larger return for every incremental dollar that I invest in this more informationized view of conflict. We get a net larger return to national security than that moving that dollar to aircraft. And again, you can't be at the extreme either way. But from where we are, that's how I see it.
What we're saying is it's a lot more about how you orchestrate your forces and how you use them and how you sequence them than it is about how sophisticated each individual missile, bomb, aircraft is, which is a shift. And that's the shift, Dan was talking about at the very beginning, is that we're moving away from the individualized platform weapon being more and more sophisticated towards it's the combination of them and how I manage them as a group that becomes where the sophistication has to lie. So that the complexity of the force is where you get benefit rather than in the individual complexity of an individual system. And you can see that in Ukraine, right? So Ukraine is, been very effective against the Russians using old generation technology. So Storm Shadow, Scalp missiles, those were getting ready to be replaced. So, people talk about those being high-end missiles. They are high-end, but they are of the, 90s vintage. They're just barely newer than the Tomahawk. So, they've been very effective in using what they've got because they can orchestrate it in a way that's going to be able to take advantage of, combining unmanned systems with weapons and being able to precisely find the targets that are going to be most valuable for them to strike at a particular moment in time. So all that decision-making advantage that they're getting from technology is allowing them to be more effective than the Russian force that arguably has individually much more sophisticated weapons like the Kinzhal and the Caliber. But they've not been able to really take advantage of that because they lack that decision-making advantage.
So the thing that's so interesting here is you two are telling a story of shifting from these expensive, technologically advanced / complicated weapon systems to these more commoditized products. Very clearly, and you saw this during the Cold War and the post-1990 space, obviously the United States has an almost asymmetric advantage. If the question is who could build the best aircraft carrier, who could build the best generation fighter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On the one hand, it's, exciting to hear about technology. That's something the United States tends to really excel in. On the other hand, I hear commodity. I hear, okay, there are also other nations that don't quite share our interests who could succeed in an environment that's much more commoditized. So Bryan, you could take this up first. Speak to how other nations, especially ones that we're in great power rivalry with, are able to navigate a world that's more about commodity rather than just, expense and budget and, the quality of our PhDs.
And you're seeing it in Ukraine. You've seen it in Nagorno-Karabakh. You're seeing the leveling of the technological playing field, essentially, because these information technologies are much more available to each combatant in a fight. So you're starting to see situations where the edge that you get is very fleeting. And it's not derived from having some secret weapon that the other side does not have yet. And I think that what that means, though, is that we're going to have to start using operational art and force employment to gain advantage much more than relying on our technological benefits or technological edge. So that gets to how do we train our people to be able to take advantage of decision-making technologies like command and control tools, some of which are powered by artificial intelligence. How do we design our force to provide the most options to commanders so that they're able to exploit their creativity, right? So the force of today, if you go out in the field or the fleet now, it's composed in of a very relatively small number of very expensive manned units and a relatively small number of expensive missiles and weapons. So there's only so many ways you can mix and match that force. If you're an opponent like Russia or China, you can sort of game out what that's likely to look like. There's only so many ways the U.S. can fight. We can make sure we're countering all those different mechanisms. We're in a good position. If the U.S. starts to field this much more diverse, heterogeneous force with more uncrewed systems and a lot more commoditized weapons, then it might become a little harder to figure out, well, how are they going to fight on any given day? And it puts the onus on commanders to be able to take advantage of the diversity of forces they have available to them and their own creativity and decision-making tools. And we've done wargaming along these lines in the Mosaic warfare work that Dan brought up. But you can see a distinct advantage to the force that's given that ability to be creative compared to the one that is stuck with a force that's relatively limited in its operational versatility.
To acknowledge, the U.S. does have an advantage in technology and its high-end platforms today. The systems we make are the best in the world, and that's a good thing. But even though that's an existing advantage, it is if you only leaned into that, it ends up being a vulnerability. Because we depend on them so much that you don't have other options. In a chess game, what would you rather have, right? Do you want 2 knights and no pawns, or do you want like 1 knight and 6 pawns? For the same price, right? You actually get a lot more options, and you're able to impose many more dilemmas. And so this idea of we want more options and we want to be able to impose more dilemmas is really core to this. And when Bryan talks about command and control and investing in battle management and sense-making technology, that's what we're doing. If we want to enable it. And one of the reasons to think that the U.S. could have a structural advantage there is, well, because the U.S. does have a lot of combat experience, and that there is this aspect that's built into our training of, we expect officers and to be able to take initiative. Like, you might not be able to call up to higher headquarters. You might have to make a local decision based on, without full information. And that if you build a force around that, which we believe to be an advantage, right? And you build out a lot of options, there's a reason to think that the U.S. could have a real strategic advantage with a force designed around those precepts.
What's an example of a dilemma we could impose using what we're discussing here today?
It's just this: if the only option that the U.S. has to conduct a strike is with, I don't know, it's a B-2 bomber and a bunch of bombs inside, then your opponent knows exactly what to defend against, and they're going to spend all of the time looking for to stealth bomber, but how can I find it? Or how can I distribute my targets so I don't present a clear thing to target against. But if I combine that, if I say, well, I have that B-2 bomber, but I also have other things. I have distributed missiles that I can launch against the targets. And I have other I have special operations forces or whatever other things, right? The more options you have, then you force your opponent to think about, well, now I have to defend against each of these. I can no longer concentrate my bets. The simplest example to sort of map it out of military space and into a space that I'm sure our audience is familiar with is, let's take American football. Like, why do I want to have both a passing game and a rushing game? Because if I only have the run, my opponent knows exactly how to defend it, right? It's really no different, right? You want to increase the number of options that you have, and then you want to invest in the technologies that allow you to assemble those options on the fly and use them effectively.
So in like a Taiwan case, something that you could say is our traditional approach to dealing with the Taiwan invasion might be to use bombers and tactical aircraft with a bunch of long-range anti-ship missiles to blow up amphibious ships before they hit Taiwan. And that long-range anti-ship missile is a particular kind of missile that we have that's supposed to be very good at killing ships. Well, if you're China, you'll just develop a way to deal with that particular threat and say, well, that's the main avenue they're going to have to counter us. We can prepare for that. But now if the U.S. also fields unmanned surface vehicles that are based in Taiwan or unmanned undersea vehicles, they're going to drive out there and just get in the way of this massive armada coming across the Taiwan Strait and start blowing up ships, as if it were, Crimea in Ukraine, as we're seeing in the last couple of weeks. Well, then now have to defend against those. And you have to, the defense against those undersea and surface threats are going to actually take away from your ability to effectively defend against the air threat. And so now these multiple threats from multiple axes are creating a structured attack that now presents a set of dilemmas that may make it so that it's so uncertain of your being successful that you decide to wait and maybe not pursue the invasion after all. So that's what we're talking about, is you present these dilemmas to an opponent who is then maybe unable to get to the level of confidence they would need to have in order to mount an operation. So you've dissuaded them away from that.
And something I'm curious, going back to the reference of, post-World War II, the 60s, skunk works. I have an image of, California Sunshine and an SR-71. What does the pipeline and the ecosystem look like today when it comes to developing emerging technologies, if, once again, that skunk works model isn't quite the way we should be thinking about the current picture right now?
A big change is going to be a shift from the skunkworks model of building an individual aircraft or ship or whatever that's got these exquisite capabilities built into it, to instead the pipeline is an integration pipeline. So it's a pipeline that's focused on combining existing systems and platforms in new ways to enable new operational concepts and enable new tactics downrange for the commanders to use. And you'd almost want that pipeline to operate in near real time. So commanders in the field, as they're envisioning new ways of fighting with the stuff they've got, they're able to integrate those units into those new force combinations, which gets to this means that this pipeline is much more software driven. It's going to be focused on combining the networks, the data streams, the command and control mission planning tools of these different systems together in new ways, not dissimilar from how, an iPhone, incorporates new apps, or we incorporate new peripherals that we can attach or, connect to our iPhones using Bluetooth, for example. That kind of interconnectivity, that integration, that's going to be where you derive military advantage in the future, as opposed to making that individual system, even more exquisite than it is today.
In these last few questions, a broad thing I'm curious about, going back to the defense industrial base concern. If it's the year 2020, I don't think a lot of folks are concerned about a artillery war breaking out 2 years from now, which is why you have concerns about the artillery stocks. In this field, then, emerging technologies, commoditized aspects of it, the different things we talked about during this conversation, what should policymakers keep in mind from what you would be focused on or worried about problems? So once again, if it's artillery, we're worried about our ability to produce enough ammunition and shells. What is the concern in this category?
So first thing is, I would say it's worse than you think. You actually need to think about protraction in conflict. And there's value of thinking about protraction. So you shouldn't just be thinking about, do I have enough missiles to fight some 3-day intense war? You need to think about, what if this is a 5-year affair? What if it's longer? How are we going to deal with that? So one, the problem is worse than you think, but that also provides some clarity. If you view it in that lens, a part of what we need to do is think about industrial mobilization in this construct of preparing for protraction. It really forces you to think differently. Because that's not something that, like, adding an assembly line at one of our major defense primes is going to fix. We need our defense primes, by the way, right? They have unique capability and domain expertise, and you're not going to find that anywhere else. I'm not going to find that in a tech company. So I need that. But, we look back to the way we did industrial mobilization before. We didn't just take the defense industry and suddenly multiply their capability. We combined them with latent commercial capability, and we rethought how we built things. And we did design for manufacture, and we applied technology to the production of things. It's this set of non-traditional ideas that we need to bring back here.
I would add that, this idea of protraction is an element of deterrence, right? So it's not just, hey, we got to be prepared for the long war. We need to be prepared for the long war because that's part of how we show an adversary that we are going to be, in it. And we're not going to just kind of fall by the wayside after the first few weeks don't go well. And that's a way of making sure they understand that it's also going to be protracted for them. And that if you're a country maybe without a system of electoral politics that allows the people to feel like they can vote on whether the war should continue, that's going to be a problem. So China, Russia, they're not going to necessarily do well, as we are seeing, with a protracted conflict. So with that idea that this is a part of our deterrence strategy is to be prepared for protraction, then we need to think about how do we need to structure our industrial base to support that. And our primes need to be thinking about how do I take the capabilities of our current weapons inventory, for example, and transition it to become something that we could build on a much more modular, much more distributed basis. How do I start transitioning my Tomahawks, my long-range anti-ship missiles, my next generation strike weapons to be able to be something that I can now manufacture in multiple places to then bring together at volume or scale down the road. And then the other thing is probably the biggest thing where we do need to think about expanding the industrial capacity is in the energetics side, because that's kind of one part that you really can't duplicate with a commercial alternative. You really have to have rocket fuel and explosives that are going to come from the specialized manufacturer. But in these other areas, you could really look at ways to distribute some of that weapons and munitions manufacturing to other providers that could provide guidance systems and control systems to those weapons.
So let's close here. Early on in the conversation, it was pointed out that there are many aspects of the war in Ukraine that just don't have quite as much relevance to future-facing concerns about a conflict regarding Taiwan. I guess what I would like to close on, though, is what lessons for the emerging technology field can we take from the war in Ukraine so far, though?
So I'll say one big one is the role of decision-making and decision aids. We've seen part of the reason that Ukraine was able to successfully defend against the original or initial Russian thrust was because they were able to orchestrate their forces, respond, and be able to deliver fires on target much more effectively than the Russians were. And that was in a lot of ways because they were able to do command and control, they were able to do decision-making, they were able to leverage commercial information sources like commercial satellite imagery. And that was in large part because they took advantage of the IT revolution that happened over the last 20 years and apply that in warfare. And they were forced to do it. I mean, it was not necessarily by choice, but it was more by necessity. And then I'd say that there's other technologies that were brought to bear as well. But I'd say that's probably the key change that we saw with Ukraine, because that seemed to be really decisive in enabling them to get to the point where they are.
The ability of an alliance to work effectively together to share information, targeting information, intelligence information, the ability to throw together battle networks, right, which is how you harness that information and push that forward to somebody in military operations. This is really powerful. So, the war manifest, in the news as an attrition war, where we're counting the tanks destroyed on either side. But if you look at what's behind it, and the role of technology in enabling this decision making, it's really wild. The other thing that you can draw out from it is, if we just look at the inability of either side to have sort of extensive air operations as a part of this conflict, that's because it's a lot easier to, say, deny the free use of a domain, whether it's the ground domain with landmines or deny the air, than it is to establish dominance for it. And I think that's something that the U.S. needs to think about as it thinks about potential future conflicts. That there may be times where the U.S. can achieve its national security objectives without having to establish dominance. And actually, there's a huge new opportunity space that opens up when you think like that.
That is an excellent place to end. Bryan and Dan, thank you for joining us on Arsenal of Democracy.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Marshall.
Thanks for watching. don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.